Welcome everyone to our panel on the ethics of AI in medicine. So I'm Christopher. I'm the president of the University of Auckland AI in Medicine Association, and I'll be the host of the event tonight. What our association sort of came from was a group of medical students at the University of Auckland initially. So we sort of decided that there needed to be sort of a group in the University of Auckland Medical School that sort of spread the word of AI and informatics and data science and the sort of applications to medicine that you can take from those areas. And yeah, we sort of started this club up last year, so we're reasonably new. And our very first event was a panel where we kind of spoke about, we heard from a few speakers about the impacts that AI will have on medicine and whether it will take jobs and stuff. But one of the big points that came up from that panel was that people were quite concerned about some of the ethical implications that AI would have on medicine and on people's health and life in general. So we sort of decided, as a follow-up to our very first panel, to hold this panel, which is going to be sort of a panel on the ethics of AI medicine, with a particular focus on Māori health and the inequities that could come from AI being implemented in our healthcare system. All right. So we have 3 panelists today. So I'll hand it over to you guys to make an introduction. Let's go with Kieran first.
Hi, so my name's Kieran Zucker. I am a clinical oncologist by background, but I am based at the University of Leeds in the UK, where my academic work focuses on the use of data science and machine learning engineering using routinely collected health data. So I'm also a fellow of the Faculty of Clinical Informatics, and in the UK do a lot of work in terms of encouraging kind of early career clinical informaticians. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
Hi. Thanks, Chris, and great to meet everyone. My name is Jay Harrison. I'm the CEO and founder of Edison Health. We're a preventative health company with a focus on precision medicine and precision health, leveraging exceptional talent, people, science and technology. And we've got I guess from a big kind of tech focus for us in terms of our progression and roadmap. And I guess the kind of like from a mission or kind of position, our goal is how we use these technologies to radically improve people's health. So we kind of look at the interesting kind of phase of where we're at in kind of in this time, and look at the kind of sick care system as being, or the current healthcare system has been a sick care system, and what we think is needed as a true healthcare system, and that those two things, when a proper healthcare system lifted up, you'd have a symbiotic and a better distributed load and a better sick care system. So yeah.
All right, and Caleb.
Tēnā koutou katoa. My name's Caleb Moses. I'm a data scientist. I work at a place called Dragonfly Data Science. I'm working on a big project called Papareo. Basically, we're building machine learning models that can, what's the word? Interact with the Māori language in some way or another. So, I've been spending the past couple of years working on Māori speech recognition, speech synthesis, all of those kinds of problems. But through my work, I've also been, I used to work for Stats NZ as a statistical analyst around privacy, and a whole bunch of other things. But yeah, great to be here.
Okay, cool. So now I'll just explain the format of this panel a bit. So essentially what we're going to have between now and around 7 p.m. is kind of a broad panel discussion. So I would have sent you guys, or you would have been sent some questions. So we'll sort of just broadly go through those questions, and I'll keep it quite open. So open discussion between you 3 about what you sort of think about those questions. And we'll see what sorts of things we end up talking about. Then at 7 o'clock, we'll move into some breakout room sessions. We will sort of split this group into three. So one panelist leading each group. And it will sort of just be an opportunity for some of the participants to sort of just have a discussion with you guys. So that's sort of what's going to happen at 7. So we'll have a couple of rounds of breakout rooms. But yeah, we'll start with the proper panel. So let's start with just a bit of background as to AI in medicine. So maybe just from each of you, a bit about what your view is on AI and how it will be used in healthcare in the coming years.
I'm good to go. So I guess the kind of obvious one in kind of the healthcare or medicine is efficiency through automation. Those are kind of the kind of narrow applications, but the stuff that I guess we're quite intrigued by and diving our interest in is to domains like genomics, particularly like in terms of applications and even in considerations in technologies like gene therapy and how we apply those types of how we might apply artificial intelligence in those domains. And so that's a specific area of interest for us.
So I think that one of the key things is that as time goes on, we collect more and more information about patients, and also the potential utility of that information improves. But the issue is that although we have growing information, we don't have growing clinician time. And so essentially there's an increasing burden on individual clinicians looking after individual patients, which essentially is going to hit a point where it becomes completely unfeasible. I think genetics is a great example of that, where, if we have things like whole genome sequencing, then the question is how in a limited time period can a clinician reasonably use that enormous volume of information for real world utility? And the simple answer is that they can't. So things are going to need to happen in order to synthesize that information and serve it up to clinicians in a useful way, and so that they can make use of it. And also things that currently clinicians spend huge amounts of time inefficiently doing can be made more efficient. And some of those things may be full automation, and it might be something that's completely independent, that has no clinician oversight, or it might be what some people would refer to as augmented intelligence, where essentially clinicians get information that essentially they then review and use as part of their clinical decision making, and it kind of helps inform decision making as opposed to being completely separate standalone system. Anyway, that's my view. So I think that that's kind of a huge area that's going to explode over the next decade.
Yeah, I think what I'm seeing from my work and my position, kind of working closely with government, is that there's a lot of interest in triage models. So lots of agencies are trying to speed up their pipelines, for applications for all sorts of services. And I don't see health, I'm sure that health will begin to experience pressure to do that sort of thing as well. I know that there are a lot of people who are ambitious about, applying things like deep learning and, for problems like in radiology, diagnosis as, chest scans and all of that kind of thing. There's been a lot of interest, and there are some rather large data sets that have been made open for practicing on those kinds of problems. To a certain extent, I kind of consider those things as sort of only a matter of time. I don't necessarily think that they're bad, but I think that without the right consideration, they almost certainly will. Like they almost certainly will turn out badly, at least to start, or at least for some people, but not for everyone. That's kind of what we're, that's kind of what I'm interested in making sure happens. So to a certain extent, I'm interested in anyone, I'm interested in people in New Zealand working on these problems of AI. I wouldn't say, put it away. It's a Pandora's box, but I'd say that we kind of need to be building our own expertise here, so that we've got people who know our situation, our unique, health outcomes and our history, and who can kind of use that to, kind of create that broader picture of how these sorts of models ought to be used in New Zealand.
I I think just touching on what Kieran said, what's quite interesting is that we in practice we collect we call them buckets of data. So we have genetic data, biometric data, biomarker data, and clinical data. And kind of the interesting part of this is that it's exactly as Kieran alludes to, is that it's actually kind of making sense of that and in a timely and relevant kind of way for a patient or client. And it's like, and then you think if in small scale you struggle with that, imagine you start to scale, and so you've just got this kind of complexity that just kind of exacerbates with more and more data. So it's a really interesting problem to solve, because in essence what we're trying to do is, how do you enable clinicians to give better advice and more timely and relevant advice? And the answer is kind of, it's how we master, as Kieran talked about, augmented intelligence. It's a really I guess you're solving a real problem for clinicians at the coalface.
I think also, to build on something that Caleb said, I think it is naive to try and say that we are not going to use kind of artificial intelligence, and it needs to get kind of put back in the box. The reality of it is the genie is out of the bottle. AI is here, it is being applied. And I guess the question is, how do we do that in the most appropriate, safest, fairest way for as many people as possible? And I think that often the focus is, how do we quickly make the coolest, snazziest tool that works as well as I can on this historic data set that I've got, that I know nothing about how it was generated, and then start pushing to deploy this in the real world. And the reality of it is that, as an approach, which is currently what most people do, it is completely unsafe. And that's where mistakes are going to happen. People often talk about what's called AI winters. So if you're in the kind of AI academic space, AI goes through a period of time where everyone's very excited about some new AI technology. At the moment, it's deep learning and kind of machine learning in general. People are pumping huge amounts of money in. But there have been times in the past where similar things have happened. The promises of what the technology can do are made, and then they're not quite realized. And I think that we run a real risk that if we lose trust in the utility of these things, then that could be a real setback for things that could actually be hugely beneficial to patients. Because ultimately, both clinicians and patients need to trust these tools. And it's not going to take very many kind of big news headlines about things going dramatically wrong for that trust to just completely evaporate. And it'll take a very long time to get back.
Okay, so
really interesting answers there.
Yeah, so now we've kind of alluded to it a bit, but could we touch on some of what each of your guys' kind of biggest ethical concerns would be about the deployment of AI into healthcare?
We can start with Jay again.
I guess it's inequity. It's kind of probably the first thing I say, because I mean, even with the space or domain that we're in, so to provide some context, I'm part Māori, and one of my, I guess, goals when I first started my business was, how would we started a charitable trust in 2015, and the idea was to think about the IP that we developed, how would we serve Māori? And so, and then kind of we've gone as a kind of, that's an anchor for us. It's something we've put in the ground and said, and then we'll build IP, but we can deploy it in a market where we get paid. And so the idea here is we get paid well to do what we do, but we are in a kind of, from a contextual position where we're building infrastructure to serve a much broader population. And so I guess the kind of inequity thing is the thing that I see as one of the initial, and it kind of, you can apply that thinking to like transport as an example with Tesla. Tesla wasn't available to everyone to start with, and their goal was to make transport more accessible, but in the early stages of development it's not. And so I guess that's a consideration for that's something that I think about.
Sure. So we move to Kieran now.
So I think that there's two ways of looking at this. There are ethical issues around a particular tool and how a tool functions. So typically speaking, with machine learning, the tool inherits the underlying bias of the data set on which it is trained. And so that means that, particularly when we're using real world data, the biases that already exist in wider society will almost inevitably, without specific adjustment, be then inherited by the model that you train on this. So this can cause problems in terms of ethnicity. There are great examples, particularly in the States, where they've used models that are for mortgage lending decisions, on predicting reoffending rates that are used by judges for deciding whether or not people should get parole, where you can demonstrate the fact that systematically, based on someone's ethnicity, they're likely to get a worse outcome. You're less likely to get a mortgage, you are more likely to be refused parole. And that's simply a reflection of the fact that the historic data essentially is that people were discriminated against, and that gets inherited. Now, in healthcare, that can become a problem, not just because of something like ethnicity, but because of things like clinician bias. So imagine, for example, you have a situation where you want a tool that's going to predict outcomes for patients. And let's say, for argument's sake, historically, I as a clinician think that diabetic patients do badly. And because of that, I give them atypical treatment. Okay, I think you're going to do badly. In my own world, let's say chemotherapy, I think the patients are going to get terrible toxicity. And so I'm going to give them lower doses. Okay, now, because I historically have given diabetic patients lower doses, they do worse because essentially I've suboptimally treated them. If I now produce an algorithm that predicts whether or not someone is going to live or die and for how long, and I then see a patient and I plug in the fact that they're diabetic, it will go, well, they have worse outcomes because historically they have had worse outcomes. I, as a clinician, will then go, oh, well, diabetic patients have worse outcomes, so I can't give them really strong treatment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give them a lower dose. And so all I've done is I've kind of introduced a form of confirmation bias by virtue of a very highly accurate AI tool. And so essentially what we've done is we've just compounded healthcare inequality through our historic practice, which has been a kind of unequal healthcare provision. And so this is a very real problem within the development of algorithms. Then you have the problem, which is separate to that, on the issue of appropriate use of a tool, okay? And that's fundamentally different. You can have a great tool, but that's inappropriately used. And there's two ways that I commonly see this happen. Number one is where you train a tool in one population, and then you assume that that tool is going to work in all populations. So if you have healthcare issues that are fundamentally different based on, for example, geography, ethnicity, and you have gross underrepresentation of those geographies and ethnicities in your underlying training set, you can't assume that it will work equally well in this other population. So you will train it in an affluent population in London, and then you'll deploy it in a diverse population in the north of England that has, much lower socioeconomic kind of standards. Those two groups may well function fundamentally differently and have very different health problems. So the accuracy of that model then doesn't work as well in that alternative population because they have unique health problems that are fundamentally different. The other problem that we sometimes see is the fundamental misunderstanding of the difference between models for the purpose of explaining and models for the purposes of prediction. And those two things are fundamentally different. And what you will often see is you will often see people build a machine learning model that works really well at prediction, and then look back at what the strong predictors are, and then use those strong predictors and say, this is the place that we need to target our intervention because this is the thing that is causing whatever it is that I'm interested in. And that is fundamentally mathematically wrong because it is not designed for drawing causal inference. And we all know this intuitively. There is a clinical finding which is called the diagonal earlobe crease. And it's exactly what it says on the tin. It is a diagonal crease across your earlobe. And if somebody has this, they have a higher probability of having cardiovascular events, okay? But what we all know is that if I, as a clinician, get a syringe of collagen filler and squirt it into their earlobe and the crease disappears, that is going to do absolutely nothing to modify their cardiovascular risk. And that's because the earlobe crease is a surrogate marker for other things. genetics, environmental exposure. And the whole principle behind prediction is that you want the smallest number of variables with the greatest predictive power. So what that essentially means is that the methods are designed to involve things that are markers or contain information about lots of different things. It is not designed to explain. So to try and use the diagonal earlobe crease as a way of intervening, intuitively we all know is wrong. However, when you port that into a different context, people will often do this. So whether or not that's looking at healthcare inequality and saying, oh, look, this is, you know, something that's causing healthcare inequality, or whether or not you're looking for why people have bad outcomes, ultimately, that approach is not correct. And it has massive potential to introduce dangerous healthcare interventions that look like they're evidenced, but actually aren't.
It's a really interesting answer. It speaks to a whole lot of statistical biases and things that can creep in to kind of corrupt a model, but kind of project it out to a higher level that can be kind of a bit more under the radar and a bit more sinister than you might think. So thanks so much for that answer. That's really great. We'll move on to Caleb.
Yeah, no, I thought that answer was really great as well. Thanks, Kieran. I think that aside from that, the things that I wanted to add are, so I don't know, I've mentioned triage models before, but I'm going to mention it again because I really do think that that's kind of, that at least like in 2020, that's the front line. Like those are the first things that are going to happen, like, yeah, triaging. Because like, for example, I mean, you may or may not be aware that triage models are being used for ACC at the moment. So when people submit an application for ACC to cover for, you know, costs due to injury, there is a triage model in place right now that takes that application and then decides if it's high or low risk. And if it's high risk, it's put into another bin where humans check it carefully. And if it's low risk, then it gets the fast treatment. And it's something that sounds reasonable, you know, and it's something that sounds reasonable, except when, you know, that high risk, low risk category differs across, you know, certain populations. I remember I heard someone say once that, you know, if we're only moving some people up the queue, are we really disadvantaging anyone? And the answer is obviously yes, right? So, like, for example, you know, and if you were to consider something like visas, if you speed up visa applications for people from certain countries, then you're systematically increasing the time that it will take for someone from not from those countries to get a visa, and that can, you know, that can have terrible effects on them. You know, like you can, in some cases, you have people who are waiting well over a year, you know, in order to gain access to New Zealand. And then another thing that I was thinking about was, you know, like we often, you know, that like some of these technologies are here and they're here in the real world. Some of them are, you know, kind of hypothetical, or we know that they're in development, but they haven't been rolled out into production just yet. And one of the things that we also talk about, or I also like to talk about, is what happens when the model isn't perfect. You know, so like if it like works, but it kind of works, then like what does that usually mean? Historically, and certainly in a lot of other applications, you know, such as like, I don't know, face detection or image recognition, the models will catch the average case really well, and then it'll be those people who differ from the average where we'll have really bad performance, and its worst case performance might not even be bounded necessarily. And trying to understand, you know, while trying to put in place standards to emphasize the need to consider all of these issues are really important, and something that, you know, I'm also interested in working on. And, you know, I have people that, you know, I'll probably talk with more about this later on and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, that's all. Well, at least for now.
I think also building on what Caleb has just said, another interesting ethical conundrum is about the issues around responsibility. So the thing is, if a tool is shown to be 90-something% accurate in whatever task it is, you know that it has a degree of failure rate, okay, where it gives the wrong answer. If I, as a clinician, am given a tool, which I know is accurate most of the time, ultimately, whether or not I choose to agree with whatever decision it spits out or not, if the decision I take is wrong, who's responsible? What are the legal and ethical challenges around me saying, I, as a clinician, believe that I know more than this algorithm that's been shown to be highly accurate? But equally, what responsibility do I have if I simply say, oh, well, it's highly accurate, so I'm going to accept that decision, and then it goes wrong? Am I, as a clinician, responsible? Is the developer responsible? Is the hospital who licensed the software product responsible? Are we all responsible? Legally and ethically, who is responsible when stuff goes wrong when you employ a tool like this? And it's a bit different from most other medical devices. You know, ultimately, if there's a manufacturing defect in an artificial hip, it's quite clear who that is. If a problem arises because I put in an artificial hip and I didn't follow the manufacturer's instruction, it's quite clear who's at fault. But with AI tools, it's a lot murkier. There's no clear answer. And I don't know that anyone has a decent answer to this, but the question is, who is responsible?
Yeah, really interesting. It seems to me like some of the reason that this area may be a bit more murky is that the decisions being made by the tool are a bit more nuanced or complex, such that there's kind of room for interpretation, and it more than like, you know, if you don't follow a set of instructions replacing the hip or something, it's quite clear who's at fault. But having a set a bit more data points than a human could ever process, which is the whole point of the model, means that it's a lot harder to know if the prediction that you're actually getting out is good in this particular case. So yeah, that is a really interesting point there.
Yeah, one of the discussion points that came up that kind of stood out to me, and I've heard of it quite a bit, is sort of the confirmation bias idea that Kieran brought up and Caleb also spoke about, where it's sort of the existing data that's building the models and are leading to biased models if we've got biased data. So what I'm sort of wondering is there any way that we can mitigate that bias and create models that are less biased even if we do have biased data?
So I personally think that the first step is the machine learning community accepting that this is a problem and looking for it specifically. Because I think a lot of the time, I don't know whether or not people are not aware of it or people choose to ignore it as a problem. The moment you know it's there, you start looking for it. And at the moment, the point of retrospective testing on your data set is usually the point at which people start to advocate deployment. Okay, so typically speaking, people will have a large data set, they'll split it into a training and a testing data set, they'll train, they'll then show in their testing data set that it works really well, they'll have a certain accuracy rate, and then they'll go, well, you know, this is an argument for how we're going to deploy this. Now, if you could change that conversation and say it's not an AI tool, it's a drug, okay, then if I had built a drug and then trialed it in a very small number of people in a very certain population, you would be very cautious about me saying, right, now let's start prescribing this to everybody. You'd go through a series of tests, which are the different the three phases of trials typically, and then some people go on for a phase 4 trial. And the idea behind that is as you start testing something in a wider population, the unexpected consequences start to become apparent. And so people will start reporting that there's unexpected side effects, and people will start to identify that maybe there's certain groups that it doesn't work in. And that's the whole principle behind a clinical trial. We don't have that same concept with AI methodology, but I'm a firm believer in the fact that prospective trials where you understand the tool and the potential pitfalls that you may have absolutely no idea are there. There may be biases in your data that you simply couldn't have seen coming. But actually, if you started to test it and see whether or not there are certain communities where there is a higher type 1 error rate, to see whether or not you start getting dodgy decisions in particular groups, or that you can't pick up certain diagnoses with certain outlier findings, etc., then you can start to understand the tools. So that's number one. Number two is that too often there is a disconnect between the person who is developing a model and the person who has developed a data set. And often data provenance is a huge issue. So knowing how a data set was put together and what the potential limitations of that data set are is hugely informative in understanding how that might impact on the resultant model that you build. And what typically happens is people will go and they'll say, I want to build a tool in imaging, say. They'll go online and they will find an enormous cache of medical images with labels applied to it, download it, and then build a tool using whatever current methodology they want to use. But they have no understanding of the data set, how it was put together, how those labels were applied. And this was seen in action in spectacular style with a project by Stanford called ChexNet. So I don't know if you have come across this, but ChexNet made massive headlines globally. The idea was that they built a tool that could identify whether or not a chest X-ray had evidence of pneumonia on it, okay? And so what they did was they pitted their model head to head against clinicians, consultant radiologists or attendings, depending on where you are in the world. And what they showed was their tool outperformed, senior radiologists. So they said, we have built a tool that far exceeds the capabilities of clinicians. And what we should be doing is we should be deploying this in places that don't have, the expertise, and isn't this wonderful? But there was a fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem was that the data set that they used had diagnostic labels applied by applying NLP to the radiology reports, okay? And there's a big problem if you stack machine learning models, in that you inherit the bias, not only of the data, but the bias of the model that you've used to generate that data. And the problem was the NLP didn't work very well. So in fact, if you look through the data set, the diagnostic labels that are applied to the images are wrong. And they're systematically wrong for certain things. So essentially what they've done is they've built a model that's really accurate in applying the wrong label, so the wrong diagnosis, because the data is wrong. So then when you ask a clinician what's the answer, the clinician gives the right answer, but it's wrong according to the ground truth, which is the label that's been applied. So their accuracy is very bad. And the model is really well fitted to this inaccurate labeling system. And so what ends up happening is it looks like the model's performing really well, but actually when you deploy it in the real world, it's spitting out the wrong answer, but systematically spitting out the wrong answer. And so it's a great example of how this disconnect between how the data set was put together and scrutinized before they built the tool then translates to real world problems. And not enough people spend enough time getting to know the data set and what the pitfalls are of the data set before they even start throwing a machine learning methodology. And that's really where things like descriptive and exploratory analysis are crucial in any machine learning pipeline. And if you can, picking the brains of people who have a better understanding of data provenance.
Thanks for that, Kieran. So sort of testing the data sets, testing the models properly. Right.
You'd think that would be something that was just so obvious that people would be doing it, like before you deploy a model, you'd want to make sure that what you're actually fitting, the labels, were accurate to what you're trying to predict. But clearly, something that is potentially cross-disciplinary, you can come into machine learning from a purely technical standpoint without any knowledge of whether a certain condition has certain symptoms or not. You can believe your model to be accurate. So I think that really emphasizes why having discussions like this, particularly for people who potentially don't have a technical background or vice versa, to understand from both sides the problems we're trying to solve so that we can make sure these things don't happen. So yeah, good to emphasize why we're doing this tonight.
It really highlights the responsibility issue, doesn't it?
Totally.
Yeah. I have a couple points to add. So yeah, I really like Kieran's point. I really like Kieran's explanation. I definitely think that medical applications of AI need to lay out a strategy for how they're going to measure the performance across all different populations, right? Like, I mean, like, I'm sure that in typical medical trials, this sort of thing is done as well. And they basically they need to be at least as rigorous. And I guess, like, to a certain extent, like, as I was thinking about it, you know, it's a bit like testing for COVID-19, right? There's this invisible enemy, and you need to make it visible in order to know how to handle it, you know? And making explicit the need to, you know, to answer questions about how it performs on disadvantaged populations, how it performs on people who have, you know, comorbidities and all that kind of thing. That's really important. There are also, you know, another important thing is seeking out model designs that have explanatory value. So, you know, there's a lot of deep learning models, you know, are like black boxes, and I guess to a certain extent, they're all going to be black boxes because, you know, the way that machine learning works. But what you can do is instead of trying to solve the easy problem of do they have pneumonia or not, you can solve harder problems. You know, try to ask, you know, not just do they have pneumonia, but, you know, where is it, or what can you see, or can you tell us more about about what you're seeing that's wrong or that's setting you off, you know. That's the kind of thing that and then products like that, they may be more useful in diagnosis, in the sense that, you know, the person won't just get a number which is like a score, you know, of like 76% likely that they have whatever. They, you know, you'd hope that you can give them not just you know, there's a score, but this is where the model thinks the problem is, and then the clinician can look at it and be like, I wasn't looking there, or maybe, I know that that's not a big deal because I see that sort of thing all the time, and clearly it's wrong, you know. So yeah, so those are two thoughts that I thought I wanted to make.
I think the explainable AI point is also really important, because in some ways, a lot of the applications of AI are in sometimes nuanced decision making. So there's not necessarily a clear-cut answer. And in some ways, explainable AI has advantages over human decision making in the context of these nuanced decisions. The reason being that there's huge amounts of evidence to show that people are really good at coming up with plausible post hoc explanations for biased decision making. Okay, so if I as a person am left to make a decision, whether consciously or unconsciously, I might make discriminatory decisions, and I can probably come up with a reason that doesn't sound discriminatory as an explanation for that. An AI solution is a complex mathematical representation of patterns within historic data that help you to do a particular task in reality. So if I can get an explanation to a greater or lesser extent out of that model, there is no post hoc justification. It is just an explanation of the maths that underpinned that decision. And so you have, in some ways, a greater chance of being able to identify the faulty logic behind the decision making than if you ask a person who's made a human decision that is fundamentally biased. So in some ways, you can argue that if this is done right, it has real advantages over simply trying to scrutinize people's decision making.
Yeah, it's more transparent, right?
Okay, cool. So we've spoken quite a bit about some of the technical things that we can do to mitigate some of the ethical issues like explainable AI. But something that I was wondering, maybe this might be a bit more directed towards Jay, but the other two could feel free to chip in as well. What sorts of regulations are already in place, if any, around AI and maybe even technology more broadly being applied to healthcare? And are more regulations needed in this space?
It's a great question. It's a little bit like the Wild West, and you think of just listening to Kieran's example of, you know, like the kind of the process that drug regulation, or the process of drug regulation, you know, whereas in essence you could have quite a dangerous model in place without any level of regulation. And I think the interesting part for us is I look at things like genomics, like if you think of if you're using, you know, try to I guess use genetic data to infer anything in regards to health advice, is that, I mean, even like the integrity of the data set, like we think of the Māori genome hasn't been mapped, and that was something I only learned quite recently. So if you're using kind of like if we're trying to help Māori and we're not even using the right and applicable data set, and that's kind of dangerous. And if you use that if we're applying this with artificial intelligence without any level of regulation, then you've just got this compounding effect in terms of the types of advice that the clinicians are giving. So yeah, I mean, we don't see anything like that in New Zealand in terms of there's an absolute discussion. This forum's a good place for these discussions to start, but commercially we haven't come across anything.
Yeah, I know that in terms of legislation, that's absolutely true, like unequivocal. I know that through my work at Stats, that Stats they've put together the algorithms charter, to put forward some standards for how algorithms ought to be used, especially if they're likely to affect society. It's interesting, and I definitely think it's worth reading. At the same time, like it's faced some criticism as well in terms of being a bit soft and all that kind of thing, which I suppose I don't know, like some of us have kind of come to expect that, but it would really be good to have a tougher set of guidelines kind of hammered out. Yeah.
So a bit of
so
go
I can't
ahead.
obviously speak. I can't speak obviously specifically to New Zealand, but I think that this is a global problem. And the reality of it is, I don't think anywhere currently does this well. I think probably the greatest thing that we have is pretty low level, which is a European regulation called GDPR, which is basically all about kind of use of data and data privacy. And in amongst that, it essentially says that if you have something that is making automated decisions, there has to be some kind of explanation for why that decision happened going alongside it. So essentially what's happened is that has ended up forcing people to use some degree of explainable AI. But the reality of it is, it can be really low level and lack any utility. And I think that there's two areas potentially for regulation here. There's the regulation of how you develop and test and deploy a tool, but then there's also all the sorts of professional regulation side of things, which is also slightly different, in the same way that, the kind of drug discovery pipeline is well regulated, but clinicians are also regulated. There is an argument for saying that there need to be some kind of professional standards, because unlike drug development, a 14-year-old can go online, download a data set, develop a tool using the skills that they've learned from Coursera, and come up with something that they might try and advocate as being used. That same 14-year-old can't go into their shed and develop a new drug. The kind of technology gulf is much narrower in AI in some ways than it is in other healthcare development environments. And so that essentially means anybody can do this. And whilst that's great to be able to kind of democratize healthcare AI, that also comes with the problems of, does that person understand the statistics? Does that person understand the pitfalls? And should there be more regulation around the sorts of people and the sorts of things that people should or shouldn't be doing in developing this? And I'm not necessarily saying that that's the right approach, but it's certainly something to consider.
I think a lot of this comes down to kind of even just the broad awareness of what artificial intelligence is. Like, there's, I mean, I could have a conversation at a board table, and I tell you what, like, there'd be 0% of the people in the circles that I'm talking with who would have any clue about the power of AI. Whereas, the kind of the silos of these discussions are so small because it's relatively new technology, that I think it's critically important that we do exactly what Kieran said, that there's this kind of awareness brought to the forefront, because you've got, it's a completely different applications, but things like Facebook and Google, who are just kind of steaming ahead of everyone else, and with and they're just completely unregulated. So it's a fascinating thing to consider.
Yeah, that's a really interesting response there, Jay. With 0% kind of knowing at a high level decision making within companies, even if you extrapolate that to the general population as well, a lot of people don't know what AI is and what it's about. And particularly with, as you say, Facebook and Google and others using these tools in a way that can surreptitiously kind of influence the way that we think and behave, it's actually really important to have these discussions around regulation and making sure that that it's being kind of done effectively. So kind of a follow-up question a little bit to what we've just been talking about is, where do you guys see the responsibility of regulation lying? Is it more the role of an external regulator like a government or something to see what's happening and create laws around how things should be done? Or is it the responsibility of the innovators themselves to say, hey, we're actually breaking new ground here and traditional regulation systems actually can't keep up with us, so like we have a responsibility to and an ethical moral obligation to make sure what we're doing is valid. Which of those two approaches do you see as the future of this? Let's start with Kieran, maybe.
So I think the reality is it lies with both. In most kind of novel industries, you have the period that, as Jay referred to as being the Wild West. And the problem is that when there's absolutely zero regulation, it leaves too much scope for people to be lazy or unscrupulous. And so I think that some level of kind of legal framework needs to be put in place. But you're right that more often than not, particularly with rapidly evolving technology, legislation simply can't keep up. The technology moves too fast, legislation moves too slowly, and so you end up with an increasing gulf between kind of externally mandated things and what's going on in the real world. And what you need is large organizations who are involved in research in this domain to come together to essentially almost provide some degree of self-regulation over the top and come up with ideas and concepts that the big players sign up to. And this is actually something that's been done certainly in the UK in the pharmaceutical industry, in that there's the regulated bits that they have to do, but then there is a kind of body of large pharmaceutical companies who have created their own kind of internal regulation in a way where they have set out standards that they will all adhere to. And this actually benefits everybody, because if you over-regulate, you can massively stifle innovation. And the reality of it is companies want to do cutting edge things, and you don't want to slow them down because those things may be hugely beneficial. But at the same time, there has to be enough of a safety net to make sure that people aren't doing things that are overtly dangerous or kind of overtly discriminatory. So I think there's a role for both. The problem is, how do you get to that situation, particularly when, you know, most people can't even agree on what AI is. You know, if you ask loads, I mean, Jay makes a really interesting assessment of like, nobody knows what AI is. I think that's partly because people, you know, don't understand the technology, but I also think that that's also partly to do with the fact that it's become so sexy that stuff that's quite clearly not AI gets badged as AI. And so the problem is, like, if you badge everything as AI, these sorts of regulatory frameworks don't really need to apply to stuff. So I've seen people use, for example, an interactive dashboard and refer to that as AI. Quite clearly, there's no artificial intelligence there. But if we don't even understand what we're talking about, if we can't even define it, that's a terrible starting point. So I also think that there needs to be a more clear definition of what do we mean by AI? And are we talking here about just machine learning, or are we talking about other forms of AI? Do those regulations need to be different for the different methodologies? Difficult questions that I'm not sure I have answers to.
Yeah, I'm not sure anyone does, and that's part of the problem. All right, we'll hear from Jay. Thanks.
Well, yeah, and I think these are great points, and I think you get an inherent kind of conflict of interest because they've got, you know, it's commercially they're trying to make money, and we're still in such a discovery phase of this stuff, you know, and the kind of companies like Facebook and Google and have, you know, immense resources and talent that they pour into this stuff. And it's kind of, and so self-regulation is such a, I guess that it raises the questions when you have, how is artificial intelligence regulated in countries like China versus America? And kind of, it's like I think the Wild West, because it's such a race to something. You know, got these kind of evolving technologies that, and it's just changing so fast. Like I'm relatively new in terms of even a semi like a deeper understanding of intelligence. And the more I think about it, when you start to think of things like general intelligence, and my mind just kind of, you know, it baffles me. And so then I think, man, you've got like these concentrated pockets of development, and self-regulation seems like I just can't see that happening anytime soon, although it has to. You know, it's kind of, so at a government level, there kind of needs to be an education process and a discovery process. And in New Zealand, we have the Digital Council, which is kind of one of those things, which is a relatively new organisation, but that conversation needs to be happening at that level, so that you can get a growing awareness in the, you know, in the business community and the kind of the general community.
All right, thanks for that, Joe.
Yeah, happy to jump in. Right, so talking about regulatory frameworks, well, I mean, I certainly agree with Kieran that the responsibility is on both sides, right? Like the government needs to step up and write proper regulation, but also the industry people need to be prepared to act on it. I think when it comes to regulating AI, or I think regulation in general, I feel like you know, I'm not a lawyer, but my feeling is that regulation, it should be about reflecting our values as a society, and the way that we think about you know, our relationship with, you know, AI and the potential use in medicine. It should capture the things that are important to us, you know. And so sometimes, like last week, I gave a couple of lectures, one at Vic and one at Canterbury University, about kind of Māori perspectives on data. And I basically talked about 5 words, and I'll just bring it up briefly. So the first one is whanaungatanga, from whānau, meaning family. But whanaungatanga means like genealogy. Well, it's about genealogy. It's like understanding, in the data context, whanaungatanga is about understanding what the relationship is between the decision that you're seeing now and all of the things that were contingent on it happening before it got to you. And then there's rangatiratanga, which is about authority. Manakitanga is about mutual reciprocity and hospitality. In the data context, it's about, you know, we're giving data, you know, in order to train, you know, these networks or that kind of thing. But what are we getting back? And there's also kotahitanga, which is about collective benefit. So are you striking the right balance between, you know, individual benefit and collective benefit? I think that, yeah, these things, they're always trading off against one another. And it can be quite hard to choose what's best. And the last one that I talk about anyway is kaitiakitanga. So a kaitiaki is it's like a guardian and or a caretaker. And so kaitiakitanga is about, you know, is our data being kept safe from improper use? Is its value and integrity being treated with respect? You know, like these are the kinds of things that that I would like to see, you know, in kind of most broad discussions around the use of data, and like AI ethics and AI medicine are kind of no different. You know, you can kind of take these words and like apply them to lots of different contexts, and I think that you end up having really interesting conversations and really interesting thoughts that kind of place you like not just like in an individual, you know, who owns this and, you know, like all of that kind of stuff. You can actually think about, you know, like the collective and yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah, thanks.
There's one other area I've suddenly thought of where kind of this sort of filtering can come in that I didn't mention, which is actually in the commissioning side of things. So you don't rely on self-regulation. You don't rely on regulation from the government. What happens is people who are doing the purchasing essentially have a framework that they use for the burden of proof that is required. And this is actually something that's been done in the UK. So because the majority of healthcare is provided by the state through the NHS, all tools that are provided, both medical devices and drugs, end up having what's called a National Institute of Clinical Excellence assessment before they can be routinely given on the NHS. And essentially, it's a health economics assessment. But what they've done is they've produced guidelines about what burden of proof is required for digital health tools, depending on essentially the scale of potential impact. So the amount of testing that's required for commissioners to be able to accept something that's, let's say, a personal fitness tracker, which is just providing patients with information about what they're doing in their day-to-day life, is fundamentally different from something that may impact on clinical decision making. And so they've set out a framework for what sorts of evidence is required. I personally think that that doesn't go far enough in what they say is needed, but it's another route to potentially having this filter about what's safe or what's got enough evidence, is if the people who are doing the actual purchasing of tools have a framework that appropriately scrutinizes the evidence for them.
Great idea.
All right then. I just wanted to go back to something that Caleb brought up. So we've spoken quite extensively about sort of the inequity idea and the effect that these inequities and AI can have on Maori health. I sort of wanted to ask a bit quickly, this would probably be more towards Jay and Caleb. What sort of opportunities does AI bring for improving the health of Māori?
Okay, I think I'll jump in. I mean, anything that's well, okay, I guess okay, so here's one, broadening access, right? So insofar as AI is able to make it easier for people to gain access to health treatment, like there's an obvious benefit to Māori there insofar as they're probably disproportionate consumers of the health system, you know, because, you know, they die earlier and all of that kind of thing. So that seems like one obvious thing. But I think if you were to ask, I mean, well, you have asked Māori because I'm Māori. I was going to say if you were to ask Māori what they think, I feel like Māori are excited about the opportunity to apply their own worldview in the review of these kinds of algorithms. You know, like I feel like Māori, you know, Māori are aware that they have a lot to offer, and they want to offer advice and you know, general kind of just advice about how these things are done and what things matter to them, what things are likely to have impact. I have a feeling that there are probably a lot of easy ones that are being left on the table. Hopefully, with the right kind of, you know, statistical lens, you can kind of shine a light on that and then get resource where it's needed. I would certainly like that very much. But yeah, that's all I'll say for now. If I have more thoughts later, I might say more.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's, I guess I think the progressive improvement in the systems that we deploy, you know, that can be in improved interventions or connectivity or yeah, I think I kind of see I don't know if it specifically applies to Māori, but I think the idea that our healthcare system is you know, globally kind of is recognized because we're a small country and we've got a relatively good healthcare system. So I think kind of the broadening accessibility is one of the key things that I can see as a progressive benefit to Māori. But I also think that we've got very active and investing, you know, or iwi that are looking to support their people. And a really good example is the, you know, it's a first step, but you had the I think it was one of the Auckland iwi that had health insurance covered for the entire iwi, and I thought it's a good start, you know, because it says that there's this desire to invest. But yeah, it's a very good question. That's kind of stumped me a bit, so I'm gonna spend more time on that.
Can I come back with an answer that's going to be more about minority ethnic groups in general, because I can't obviously speak specifically to the question that you've asked.
No, that sounds great.
One of the things that is a real problem is underrepresentation of minority ethnic groups in traditional medical studies. So this is a problem globally, where we have a very heavy reliance on randomized controlled trials. And the problem with randomized controlled trials is they often have very tight eligibility criteria. Combine that with the fact that in general, minority ethnic groups are less likely to actively participate in studies, as are people who are from lower socioeconomic groups, which often then creates a double whammy, because essentially often minority ethnic groups are also amongst the lower socioeconomic groups in a lot of countries. So what that essentially means is we conduct a study, we trial a drug, and we trial it in affluent white individuals and show that it has a given efficacy, okay? And then we extrapolate that across the entire population, even though the majority of people are not represented. So this is really well evidenced. And in fact, in oncology where I work, they did a study and they looked at the eligibility criteria of oncology studies, and they showed that on average, only 20% of oncology patients were eligible for studies. That basically means that we're taking information on 20% of the population and extrapolating that onto 80% of the population. Now, the big advantage of using things like AI is that where you can consider a randomized controlled trial to be the perfect data on the imperfect population, routinely collected data is in effect imperfect information on the perfect population because it's got everyone in it. So the question is, can we start to build tools that actually represent those underrepresented individuals so that we can start to actually make healthcare decisions that's based on real information on those minority ethnic groups, where historically, essentially, they've been completely cut out of the evidence cycle. And so I think that that is one potential area, and whether or not that's in therapeutics or clinical decision making or whatever it is, where there may be unique issues and challenges amongst particular populations, which we can actually start unpicking for the first time, which people haven't done historically through trials.
Thanks for that. That was a good answer, despite the fact that you don't necessarily have the background of New Zealand Maori. Yeah, I imagine that around the world and in other minority groups, a lot of the ethical issues would be quite similar.
Yeah, I think if the ways in which people could participate and give their data to inform these models and studies, if the barriers to that are decreased, you could also, in addition to ethnic minority groups, maybe people who are in kind of remote settlements and so on, if there's ways that we could enable collection of data from those groups. Obviously, the more data you have, the better that the sample that you fit the model from is more representative of the population, or to the extent that it can match the population as exactly as possible, the better the model will be overall. So I think, yeah, it's really interesting you say that actually this technology might give a platform to gather data in a way that we haven't been able to before. It'll be really interesting to see what the applications of that might be in the future. Yeah.
A question for Kieran on this would be just that, like, when you think of minority groups, so let's say like the challenge is access. You've got a minority and then you've got a small data set. Like, you know, have you seen kind of examples of how they tackle that? Or are you saying that we kind of consider this and that we just take a broad sweep of, you know, you've got like a total pool of data and you recognize minority in that? Have you seen any examples of how that's considered?
So I guess it depends on the challenge that it is that you're looking to solve. So I think if one of the things that you're looking at is you're looking at healthcare inequality in terms of how people first interact with the healthcare system, then it becomes incredibly challenging because you can't quantify the information that you don't know. I think when you're looking at treatment decisions in an established population. So let's say you're looking at decision making once people have been diagnosed, then it becomes a lot easier, because what you can do is you can combine all the healthcare data for all of the individuals with a particular diagnosis, irrespective of ethnicity, and then study that, because you essentially capture all the information on all individuals. And so I think it's in that circumstance where there are the greatest gains to be had for minority ethnic groups. The challenge, though, is when you're talking about people accessing health services and that there are inequalities in people accessing those services in the first place, it's that you don't know the information that you're missing. And in fact, that's the thing that you're most interested in. You're interested in the information you haven't got. And I don't know how you go about solving that. I think the solution there is probably more of a policy decision about how do you go about improving access, and saying, actually, that's not a challenge for computer science, that's a challenge for government.
All right then, I think that just about comes to the end of the panel.